Welcome to the Reverie Nature Podcast. I'm Chad Clifford, your host, and today is part 1 of Animal Tracks and Sign, where we will lay the foundation to get your tracking skills up to speed. I've been teaching these skills for decades, practicing them even longer, thousands of photographs taken, hundreds of hours of dirt time. Tracking is a fantastic way to explore and experience the woods. I've created tracking posters, tracking rulers. I'm excited to share this with you. Let's get going. In the Reverie Nature Podcast, you can expect to find a wide variety of topics on the nature experience, from bushcraft, survival skills, nature lore, animal tracks and sign, storytelling, nature soundscapes, and much more. These are the lessons and skills I've been teaching for decades. So before we dig in, please take a moment to subscribe and consider offering your support to the podcast. When I bump into other tracking students or folks who appreciate animal tracks, especially the ones who take it a little more seriously and are digging into it as a hobby, I always find it interesting who their mentors were. Where did they get their information from? Because they have very different approaches. For instance, I come from the lineage of Tom Brown Jr., and I think, at least to me, he is the guy for animal tracks and signs. So if you haven't checked out Tom Brown Jr.'s books, check those out. He has a series of animal tracking books, including tracking stories. Extremely good lecturer as well, Tom. I haven't checked out his stuff in the last decade or two, but very influenced by him. He got me onto this stuff. I've taken a few courses from him back in the early 90s, I guess it was. That lit the fire for me. I was full on tracking then for a long time, taking, as I said earlier, thousands of photographs. Really, really enjoy it. And contrast this with all the other different mentors or resources out there on animal tracks and sign. They all have their own approach and their own ways of teaching or showing you how to decipher the world of animal tracks and sign, and it's all great. In fact, I'll get into talking about briefly my library of books and talk about some of the standards and what each book maybe offers. And they all do offer something different. I don't have one tracking book that doesn't offer something new and something that the others do not have. So if you really get into animal tracks and sign, you're going to be collecting a few books. With that, there is a new book out too that I will be talking about. After teaching animal tracks and sign to many different groups and individuals, the lessons that I learned from other people and the stuff I've taught, it all kind of blends together, and I'm having a hard time sometimes remembering what I learned from where and how I adapted it and how I've changed it to my own teachings. But I like to start with this, and I'm pretty sure this comes from Tom Brown Jr. If you were to take a moment and stand up, close your eyes, and concentrate on your feet muscles, the muscles in your feet and how they respond to different movements. So if you're standing there with your eyes closed, or just imagine that you're doing that if you don't want to, raise out your front arm. Notice how the muscles in your feet respond to that. Twist your body. Notice how your feet move to support that. Do something like turn your head. Can you tell how your feet are moving to respond to that head movement? All these things show up in animal tracks, all these minute movements, and you need to be on your game to see these things in the tracks, but it can be done. I've spent quite a few hours. I have made a sandbox for animal tracks and to learn how to see these different movements within the tracks, and I don't pretend to be great at it. I have gotten to the point where I can read things in a sandbox, in other words, perfect or ideal conditions. A lot of these things are, when you're seeing it in real life tracks in less than perfect conditions, you do pick up some clues and signs from your hours in the sandbox, but you're getting to the head movements in harder terrains. More broadly though, if we take each animal track, an individual track, consider that like a letter, and that a collection of tracks is like a sentence. And when you take that sentence and you take in other or other sign and consider the habitat you're in, now you have a paragraph or even a chapter of a book, and you start to see how things are fitting together and understanding and even predicting the movements of animals and what they might be up to. Consider the landscape like an open manuscript, a big story being told, and the animals are part of that, especially in the wintertime, obviously, where you can see the tracks and you don't have to be a great tracker to follow tracks in the wintertime, but you can start to put together the larger picture. Isn't this really role playing? You're getting into the needs of the animal. What is it thinking? Is it a predator or is it looking for prey? Does it need water? Does it need shelter? You start literally role playing, getting into that animal's head, so to speak. What are its needs and how is it responding to its environment? Is it like a deer that tends to have repetitive behaviors day after day? Like a fox that might have similar trails and territories that it repeatedly goes over, constantly on the lookout, following those smells for food. When I do tracking lectures, I have this one slide where it shows this, I don't know if it was a Doberman Pinscher or some kind of a dog dressed up in a squirrel suit. And the title at the bottom says, "To catch the squirrel, you must become the squirrel." Ordinarily, I'd wait till the end of an hour-long introductory tracking workshop to talk about my reference books and what books, I would suggest for you to pick up in order of importance, in my own opinion. But I think I'm going to actually start with that in the podcast format here, just to get you an idea of what kind of stuff's out there and what you should be looking for to dig into tracking. In following podcasts, we'll dig into my approach to teaching animal tracks and sign and how I suggest people learn and decipher what they're looking at. So before digging in here, I want to just mention that when I typically teach or share animal tracks and sign as an educational approach, I go with a 1 or 2 hour slideshow presentation for larger groups that are just sort of casually interested. When I get students who are more interested, it's typically a 3-day course, and it's intensive. We're not talking like 3 days of 6 hours. We're talking 3 12-hour days where into the evening there's slideshows. One night could be a slideshow, nothing but weasels, the weasel family, their habits and behaviors, and the individual characteristics of each species. And what I hope to do here with this series of podcasts is touch on more like the 3 days, some of the details I get into over 3 days. And obviously I won't have the photographs to show to you, but I will try and give descriptions and we'll just see how it goes. Now you might think when you're learning animal tracks and sign that the goal is to identify the track down to species level. No, that's the last thing you need. In fact, if you never learn what made the track, so what? I keep a tracking journal, and there are tracks that I have not sorted out down to the species level or figured out what made that sign. Literally for 15 years, and then I come across something in a reading somewhere that tells me another clue about a particular animal, and mystery solved. For example, I once came across, this is one of my prize finds, I just love this thing. I came across this interesting thing in the wintertime. This was up near Thunder Bay. It was on the side of Mount McKay, which is kind of a taller, I guess you could call it a mountain or a small mountain, halfway up anyway, and on the east side. And it was in the wintertime, and there was a lot of snow that year, maybe 3.5 feet of snow. And I was snowshoeing along, and a couple of feet out of the snow, there was what looked like a bird nest, like I said, maybe 2 feet above the snow. And upon closer inspection, this bird nest had a roof on it. So it was clearly a bird's nest, but the roof was made out of different materials. The roof was made out of muddy leaves, like leaves that were obviously taken from the ground and not really thatched into a roof, but just layered on top to make a roof. And I had no idea what made that, because it was clearly the construction methods were clearly changed when it came to the roof. And how often do you see a bird's nest with a roof on it, right? This is Northern Ontario, in case you're not sure where Sibley is, or Mount McKay. Anyway, years later, I can't remember which book it was, but it was just a casual mention in one of my tracking books about how a mouse will sometimes take a bird's nest, renovate it by throwing a roof on there, and use it as a cache or a place to store seeds and nuts. It is not clear if they actually spend much time in there beyond just going to get seeds and nuts. So, mystery solved. And there are many other instances where I've solved tracking mysteries years later. And that's why it's important to take notes, especially when you come across something that you can't quite sort out or figure out. Take photographs. In those photographs, you need to have maybe a coin or something to give you the scale of the track or sign you're looking at, because later it'll be pretty hard to figure that out. And take notes, take measurements. All these things are required. And if you don't do that, yeah, good luck sorting it out later. Anyway, lots of examples to talk about as we move ahead. The point being, though, is don't worry about what made the track. One reason you don't need to worry about it is as soon as people know the name of something, or if you tell someone, oh, that's a long-tailed weasel track, it's typically the response is, oh, okay, and then they move on. That's all there is to learn, right? You know what the species is. What else is there? No, that's the wrong way to approach it. Even if you do know what it is, and you've followed these weasel tracks before, go follow it. You don't have to follow it necessarily in the direction it's going. If you go actually down the cold trail or backwards, that's even better, because you don't want to necessarily be catching up to the animal and chasing it around the woods unknowingly. But find out what it's doing. You're going to learn so much and come across so many interesting finds by searching out its behaviors, what it was looking for, what it's up to. That is the fun of tracking, not just coming to something, identifying it, and move on. Same thing with plants, same thing with birds, right? It's the observation that counts, not the identification. So with that in mind, if you were going to be buying your first book or two on animal tracks and tracking, I would suggest getting one of the old standards. For instance, the Peterson's Guide to Animal Tracks by Olaus Murray, or the Stokes Guide to Animal Tracking and Behavior. These books have lots of good illustrations. They have a good description of the animal. It's fairly generic, but they offer a good overview, and they talk about each group of species, like the dog family, your foxes and your coyotes and wolves.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Calling all nature rebels and podcast aficionados, I hope you're enjoying today's podcast episode. Why not help ignite the flames of our wild community by leaving a rating and review right now? Your words are the sparks that fuel our journey. Likewise, share the Reverie Nature podcast across your social networks like the spreading branches of an ancient tree. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in wildness is the preservation of the world. Now let's get back to the podcast. For instance, in the Stokes Guide, they'll talk about the habitat, the home range, the type of food, mating times of the year, gestation periods, numbers of young, all those little details, a little scientific here and stuff you may or may not be interested in. Stepping away from the old classics like the Stokes and Peterson's guides, we have more modern things like Mammals of Canada by Lone Pine, Field Trackers, the Tracker's Field Guide, a comprehensive manual for animal tracking. Now, these books are fairly generic too, but these newer books have photographs. They have illustrations and photographs, and that's a great leap because illustrations, although they tend to show better detail, it's sort of out of context, isn't it? Like seeing the actual photograph and what those details look like in a real track in non-perfect conditions like sand, mud, snow, erosion that takes place, or the aging of the tracks. Uh, the newer generation of the Stokes and Peterson's guides, like I said, the Falcon Guide or the Lone Pine Guide, they do take it to that next level while still giving you a good background on the animals themselves to help you learn about their habitat. And as far as animal tracks and sign go, you can expect to find the various gait patterns these animals use. And of course, when you have 4 legs and you change your speed, the track pattern changes with it. These books are great for that. They show what the individual tracks are. They give you measurements of the tracks. They give you the overall size of the trail widths, I think, in most cases. So all these things will help you understand what species or group of species you might be looking at, and lots of good background to help you learn about the observations you've made and what observations that others have made that you might want to look out for. Now, another book which doesn't have much to do with tracking, as in deciphering tracks, is The Mammals of the Great Lakes Region. So if you're anywhere near the Great Lakes region, yeah, this is a great book, Mammals of the Great Lakes Region by Alan Kurta. And this book, I don't even think it shows a track in there, but what it does, it's a great resource book for the mammals of that region, and it gives you all the background you'll probably need or want. I believe in that book, if I'm not mistaken, yes, it has the dental formula and the skull formulas at the back. So when you come across signs like old skulls or a jawbone, and you're trying to figure out what that animal was, you can go to this book and key it out in the back. And along that line, there's another book called Animal Skulls, A Guide to North American Species by Mark Elbrook. And that also is pretty good. Lots of good photographs and diagrams helping you to key out those skulls should you be interested in digging into that level. Another book that I like, I don't use it all that much though, is Bird Tracks and Sign. And you might not think of birds when you go tracking, but there are plenty of bird tracks when you get out there, and more about that later. But anyway, Mark Elbrook and Eleanor Marks have a book called Bird Tracks and Sign, which is probably worth your while at some point if you're going to spend much time in the outdoors tracking. So up until this point, I've talked about fairly generic books that give you background on the various species you'll encounter in their habits and whatnot, and some track identification and sign characteristics. But if you're more serious about tracking, there are books that use the space in the book not to necessarily cover those details so much. These are the tracking books. It's focused on the tracking and sign, not so much the life cycle of the animals and gestation periods and all that kind of stuff. So that's what these other books were for. So one book that is really good is called Tracking and the Art of Seeing by Paul Resendez. How to Read Animal Tracks and Sign. So Tracking and the Art of Seeing. And when it came out, I was really impressed with that. It has great photographs. I think the best thing about this book is the photographs. It was one of the first books to have great photographs and a fair bit of insight too for animal tracks and sign. There's even photographs in some cases for some species of the animals' feet. So they must have had stuffed animals or trapped animals at some point they got a hold of to take pictures of what their feet actually do look like, as opposed to using illustrations. So that's a pretty good book. Of course, these books that I'm getting into now, the ones that are really focused on animals, tracks, and tracking. Another pretty good book, another book by Mark Elbrook, along with Leon Leibenberg and Lau, is a book called Practical Tracking, A Guide to Following Footprints and Finding Animals. Fairly generic book. It doesn't go into the kind of details on tracks and tracking that I'd normally be looking for, but it does have some pretty good sign and some pretty good photographs with some good tips in there. Another less known book probably to you would be A Field Guide to Mammal Tracking in North America by Halfpenny and Boisiot, if I'm pronouncing that right. And I don't see this book around very much, so it's fairly obscure, but it's pretty good. They got a lot of good gait patterns or typical gait patterns for animal tracks and signs, so there's some good stuff in there. All these books have tidbits scattered throughout them that are unique to that book. I don't have any one book that has all of the information. There's so many tidbits spread out through all these books. That's why I'm covering them all, not just talking about the book. However, if there was the book, for me, it would be Tom Brown's Field Guide to Nature Observation and Tracking, with the author being Tom Brown Jr. And his book goes into a lot of stories and nature observation. It's really about senses and really melting into your environment and how you really see and observe more. So he gets into stuff that will help you become a better tracker, ways to walk, ways to look, ways to listen. It's really quite interesting and entertaining, and it's a wonderful book, far beyond just plain old tracking or the details of animals' life cycle and whatnot. So I would start with that one. It goes into details like how to age a track, how to train yourself to look more closely or at a glance from tracks by doing different journaling ideas, and how to age tracks by doing certain techniques. So if you want to be a good tracker, I would certainly point you towards the Tom Brown's Field Guide to Nature Observation and Tracking. And if you like that, he does have other books on tracking, some that get extremely technical in the tracking world anyway, and that may or may not interest you, but the book I did reference is a great starting point. Now there's a new book that I have the privilege of reviewing. It's called Sticky Tracks. Learn how to identify 14 animals from their tracks, poop, and other signs in just 1 hour. Because I'm doing a review of this book anyway, I will share some of those thoughts with you here. And the first thought that jumps into my head is, wow, 1 hour. So this is going to be a pretty organized and clear and concise book. So I started with that approach, and I'm used to picking up tracking books and being fairly unimpressed. Like, there's always tidbits here and there. There's a few books that I am very impressed with, and others I have them because they're all worth having, but you kind of have to poke through it a bit to get the nuggets out of there. Now, this book by Sticky Tracks, Lawrence Holt Books Incorporated is the publisher, I guess. I started into it and I said, okay, 1 hour. And the book's fairly thick. I don't know how many pages we have here. Let's see. 240-ish pages. It's a substantial book. It's like half size. And I like the cover. The cover itself is pretty interesting. It has a silhouette of a wolf upside down with its tracks. And above the wolf, there's a person with a lens, or not a microscope, but a loupe, looking closely at the tracks. And the silhouette of that person's body shape is the wolf shadow. Very cool. And it reminds me of Sherlock Holmes, right? Out there with your magnifying glass, looking for clues, collecting evidence, not making any decisions or calls right away, just collecting evidence, making the observations, and eventually coming up with an idea of what made those tracks. So anyway, pretty cool cover. I did read it, and it did take about an hour to read. I took my time and read it thoroughly, and I must say this is a good book. And I will certainly be recommending this to folks when I do give out references for books. It's broken up into 2 sections called Sequence 1 and Sequence 2. The first section was Sequence 1 being about animal tracks, and Sequence 2 being about the sign or the habitat. This book does a really good job for an introduction into tracking. It does what it says it does. You give yourself an hour without having to take notes. It just gives you the information and really orients you to the world of tracking. It talks about the sort of things that I almost have a tendency to overlook when I'm explaining tracks to folks who are new at it. Things like there's 4 toes that tend to show up in a track from the dog family. People don't know this kind of stuff, or they're not thinking about that kind of stuff. And, with the weasels, there's not 4 toes. So they keep it simple. They keep it for the beginner. And there's lots of great tips in here that, people who have spent lots of time tracking will benefit from as well. It's very disorienting looking at a track when you first look at it. And this book does a great job with great photographs and illustrations pointing the features out for these 14 species that it's trying to orient you to. So good job on that. What I was particularly happy about with this book was the fact that I learned things. With a lot of tracking books, there's always a nugget or two, but this one, besides being well laid out and a great book to get started with if you're new to tracking, it had new tidbits for me too, of a guy who has tons of these books, similar books with photographs and illustrations. But no, this had stuff that was new as well. For instance, comparing dog tracks to wolf tracks or coyote tracks, I think it is. Just a little trick to look at the angle of the outer toes sticking out more for dogs. When it comes to the different families of animals you come across in terms of tracking, like the cat family, there's characteristics about the cats and their body shape and the way they walk, their behaviors. Same with the dog family, right? So the book does a good job of briefly pointing these things out, meant to get you on your way in an hour. This is a great book to get started. I love it. Clearly, there was a lot of thought into how this book was laid out. I'm assuming done by people who have trained others before and know the common mistakes that people make and know how disorienting it is for someone who's never paid attention to tracks to decipher what you're actually looking at. So I have to say, mission accomplished. If you give yourself 1 hour, as the book says it will do, you will orient yourself to the world of track and have a good start on getting going. So for those of you who do have other tracking books, grab this one too. It's worth having. It's a good book. So that about does it for this episode. It's already pushing 30 minutes here. So next time, I think I will dig into how I approach teaching animal tracks and tracking and sign, and maybe we'll start with the tools that I offer students and the materials that I use to get them going, including stuff I've developed myself. Thank you for joining us on the Reverie Nature Podcast. Remember to subscribe for more captivating episodes exploring the wonders of the natural world. Until next time, may you saunter forth embracing nature's song, and may the whispers of the wilderness linger in your heart.
And floating above the forest where a canopy has turned upside